Should introduce Justin Finelli, the acting CTO of the entire Navy, and the tech director of digital PEO. Is that correct? And he will explain what those buzzwords mean and when it's his turn to talk. But Justin is just an example of the variety of speakers. We're going to have companies like Hermes. Who else are we going to have, Ernestine? Do you remember?
Folks spanning investing, kind of founders of startups, government.
Right. So one of the interesting things about being a student is, unless you've been in the Department of Defense, you know, this is like alphabet soup. What are these organizations? Who are they? How they're related to each other? You know, it's hard to remember the Department of Defense is the largest company probably in the world, or certainly in the Western world. There are 3 million people, both civilians and enlisted, all working together. And that org chart could take up probably this entire room. So what I thought I'd do is just give you the first 10 minutes and teaching team jump in when I get this wrong about, you know, what does that look like? And, you know, how did we start the DoD? If you think about it, when the United States got created, we simply had something called the War Department. That's all it was war. Every other country had a War Department. A War Department was, we had land forces called the Army, and we had people in these wooden ships with sails called the Navy. And, you know, a couple years later, we probably said instead of shooting each other, we should probably talk to each other as well and have diplomats in an organization, and we set up something called the State Department. And then, by the way, the Navy realized that, oh, you know, we kind of, when we have, like, ships, we ought to have soldiers on that ships. Besides cannon, we ought to have specialized soldiers who could board other ships or maybe land on, from the ships, and we set up the Marines. And eventually, about 40 years later, the Navy said, yeah, but those Marines, since they're on our ships, should be part of the Navy. And so ever since then, the U.S. Marine Corps is actually a service as part of the Navy. You know, that stayed the same for another 100 or some odd years. But in 1926, you know, some folks in the Army realized, hey, those airplanes we used in World War I, they were kind of useful for not only spotting, you know, artillery and other things. We actually used them in combat, and we used them on early bombing missions, etc. Gee, the Army should set up a separate Air Corps, but it should work for the Army. And so in 1926, the U.S. military looked like War Department, which was then just the Army, and the Army had an Air Force, and the Navy had, you know, the Marine Corps, besides all the ships. But in 1941, we renamed the Air Corps into the Air Force. And in 1947, after World War II ended, we decided to get our little act together. Instead of the War Department, we said, well, that's a little too aggressive. Why don't we call it the Defense Department? I hope some of you were laughing, going, it's the same thing, but we did a little branding exercise, and we did some reorganization. We basically said, okay, we'll have the Army, but this time the Air Force is going to be its own service. So we spun out the Air Force from underneath the Army to become a service, a separate organization, and we set up 2 other organizations. We set up an office of the Secretary of Defense, and we created a civilian in charge of all our military in the United States called the Secretary of Defense. Does that make sense? Right? And then we also set up a kind of a way to badly coordinate all those services, something called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is just a fancy term for, we'll have representatives from the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, etc., all sitting around the table arguing with each other, but at least they're talking to each other in a building. Make sense so far? We're up to 1947. And at the same time, we realized that advice to the President of the United States was typically ad hoc, meaning we kind of had advisors to the President, but there really wasn't anything formal. And so part of this National Security Act, we set up something called the National Security Council. And it had representatives from Defense and State and Army, Air Force, Navy. And it basically was designed to give the President advice about national security policies, whether it was war or peace or something else, diplomacy. You with me so far? All right. In 1986, after wars in Vietnam and particularly wars in Grenada, we realized that having separate services, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, no longer worked in the 20th century, or didn't work well. Why? Because they were no longer fighting separate activities. When I was in Vietnam, it was truly the Navy bombed this part of Vietnam and the Air Force bombed this part of Vietnam, and they sometimes talked to each other, but mostly like for air traffic control. There was no strategy. They used different equipment, different radios, different whatever, and it only got worse. And so we realized that we needed to do something radical. And the radical part today is that the services you might know, from those of you not in the military, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, do not fight the wars. Big idea. We created a new construct. Think of it as a matrix organization called combatant commands. And the combatant commands are the ones that fight the wars. The services, they're still around. They recruit the people, they train them, they buy the weapon systems, but they provide soldiers, sailors, and equipment to the combatant commands that actually are geographically organized. So we have services, training, and equipping, combatant commands fighting, and we beefed up the Joint Chiefs of Staff to now they're responsible in theory for planning and coordinating. And so the combatant commands are, most of them are geographic, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, EUCOM, INDOPACOM, which you might hear a lot about. It's the South China Sea, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, and then we have functional ones that take care of cybercom, special forces like SEALs and whatever, SOCOM, STRATCOM.
Steve, there's more to special forces than the SEALs.
So keep going. The Rangers.
My husband will disagree.
Ernestine's got some close ties to SEALs.
Correct. But every service has their own special operating forces, let me be clear. But they all fall under this bucket. What used to be the Strategic Air Command and whatever, now all the nuclear forces are under STRATCOM, and transportation, all the C-17s, old C-5s, et cetera, C-130s, all fall under TRANSCOM. And then 2019, we stood up one for space called SpaceCom. These are the organizations that actually Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines all man and staff these organizations, but their weapon systems come from the services themselves. Again, here's just a geographic map again. As I said, we stood up the Space Force as its own organization as part of the Air Force. So now, like the Navy that has ships and planes and sailors, it also has combat troops and Marines. The Air Force now has Air Force that does stuff, guess where, in the air, and a Space Force that does something in orbit. And so the Air Force now has two organizations, much like the Navy. Remember that National Security Council that started out pretty simply in 1947? It got a little more complicated. You know, there are what's called statutory attendees, those that, quote, officially on paper are responsible for advising the president. And then think of these as the people from here on up who actually do the work. Eric, is that a fair conversation? But truly, when you hear the word NSC or National Security Council, it's not part of the military, but they're getting advice from all pieces of the military, from White House, from CIA, et cetera, from Commerce. DOD today, and this is my introduction to Justin, kind of looks like this. There's the Secretary of Defense, there's the Navy, Army, Air Force, Joint Chiefs, and then you also have the combatant commands. You also have activities that kind of support the Department of Defense in both activities and agencies. Anybody hear about the National Security Agency, right? The National Reconnaissance Office. All these are, or National Geospatial Agency, all these are basically defense agencies that support the DoD, but they're part of the DoD. Just as an aside, anybody know how many intelligence agencies that are in the Department of Defense? Anybody know?
18 is the IC. I don't know how many is DOJ.
There you go. 17 are in the DoD. Right? There's 17 separate intelligence functions inside the DoD, each with thousands of people. What's the one that's not in the Department of Defense? CIA. Reports directly to the president. By the way, as an aside, CIA has special authorities. So the DoD operates, for any of you interested in details, and there's something called Title 10. CIA has special authorities called Title 50, which makes life particularly interesting when they get what's called a finding from the president that says, go do X. The DoD can't do X, but the CIA is actually chartered to do X. I think I'll stop there. Does questions at all? I just want to give you some context about what we're going to be seeing and talking about. Seriously, any questions? Be a quiz at the end. Draw the org chart. I would truly suggest, if you don't understand the DoD org chart, some of these speakers are going to be like from Mars. Like, who are they? You know, are they like, what do you mean the person we just saw had a multi-billion-dollar budget? And if I'm a Stanford student wanting to do a startup, I probably should have paid attention because these are the people who could sign the checks. So I would spend some time after this class, if any of you are interested. All this stuff is online. Spend some time looking at the org charts and try to understand it, and come back and ask questions in the following weeks. Comments, teaching team? Well, let me introduce Justin Finelli, who's been sitting here patiently. As I mentioned, Justin's the acting CTO of the Navy. I got to meet him because he's the only guy more aggressive than I am in trying to make change inside of the Department of Defense, but he's inside of the Department of Defense and doing some amazing things that actually look a lot like startups in Silicon Valley. And for those of you who have, anybody have, I think, who's in the DoD now? Right, so on a good day, China operates like Silicon Valley, and the DoD operates like General Motors. And that's not like a diss on the people. We have world-class people, world-class organizations, but our adversaries, or potential adversaries, have decided to operate on a different clock speed. We used to know how to do that. And the good news is there are islands of innovation, including the Navy CTO, that operate at that speed. And if any of you are thinking about doing startups who want to work with the Department of Defense, this is one of the places I would start. So Justin, let me turn this over to you. Do you have some slides or want to do a Q&A, or what would be best for you?
I want to do a Q&A on you first. So just want to make sure goals are met, dreams achieved. Why are people here? So I'm going to need at least two answers. Is it because you were just listening to General Mattis and you have goosebumps? Is it because you have a startup? Is it because you have world-class instructors who are national treasures? Like, what is the reason? Can I get two quick answers?
I have a startup.
Okay. Startup. That's one answer from three people. That's good. What's one more answer?
I used to work for a sub-CTO in the Navy.
Okay, cool. And you're interested to learn. Okay. Cool. How's it going? All right.
All right.
All right. So who am I? That org chart is a big one. The world has gotten smaller. I think we've all experienced this in our own separate ways. But when we zigzag enough, when we collide, when we're working across intersections, sometimes our world gets smaller, and I think that's where things happen. From a experience perspective, my background is electrical engineering and systems engineering. 25 years in the military and IC, and like, in case you were intimidated by any of those org charts, like, it just in the last 5 years for me has gotten smaller and more approachable to the point where we can get things done a lot faster. And so what I'd tell you is, number one, be patient, and then number two, be patiently impatient. In general, we're doing a marathon by way of sprint. This long, kind of like large, arduous system wants to work. In some ways, it's a perpetual startup. Not all the best parts of the startup, but the grind, the idea of it's super Pareto. At times, there is less than 20%, less than 5% of the people who are potentially like doing iceberg type work. But when you find them, everything can change. And so there are a number of externalities that kind of catalyze activity. And one, as of recently, is, and I have a slide on this, I'll show you, is the Davidson window. And so the Chief of Naval Operations, the CNO, the 4-star, that is Admiral Franchetti, the first female CNO in Navy history, just put out what junior officers have told me is the most urgent NAV plan in at least the last 20 years. And so she points directly to the 2027, hey, let's make sure that we're ready to defend tonight and take urgent action across the board from an integration perspective across the Navy. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, so Department of Navy, Navy and Marine Corps, is working every day to get his troops to fight smarter. So two big changes afoot are one, you have the Navy that is looking at hybrid options, that is looking to disrupt itself at different speeds. And then you have a Marine Corps that did something, and you can Google this later, but Force Design 2030 that said, hey, we want to shake ourselves up. We are more like Netflix than Blockbuster now. And we are looking at how we really change the way that we operate, and their mantra right now is fight smarter. And so I want to talk about, I guess, my time in Silicon Valley, as well as any of the things that you'd like covered for how we bring new entrants in, how we think about this world of public-private partnership, and how we're operating differently than we have probably in the last 3 years. It feels different from the 22 before that for me in terms of this mesh, in terms of how, we don't say industrial policy, but everyone has seen the CHIPS Act and the IRA and what that looks like in Department of Defense, and how we buy more dual-use technology, and how we capitalize on external funding, and how we use InQtel that gets 25 external dollars for every dollar that they spend in here. And so not everyone in the DoD gets the new way of business. Not everyone in any organization gets the new way of business. But I'd like to tell you about some bright spots for how that's going differently, and what that can look like, and what it already looks like, and then maybe some of the challenges that you can work on, or be a part of, or just see move as you move through your careers.
But before we do that,
yes.
Tell us what the CTO of the Navy does.
Sure. All right. So I was just with some esteemed folks over the weekend. I know you guys have a National Security Summit coming in October. I was on a panel with the CTO of Palantir, and the CTO of Anduril, and the CEO of StriveWorks, and a few others, and everyone kind of explained their job. And there are differences and similarities between a CTO in industry and a CTO in government and DoD. Obviously, that position has been around for a lot longer in private sector. The world is going digital, if it's not already, right? And so we know and we recognize that there needs to be more technical people and mindset in the government. And so I'm essentially the second person to hold this role. I think it's been around for 4 years total, and it's seated under the Chief Information Officer. So day job, military, night job, I teach at Georgetown. I teach tech classes that don't have anything to do necessarily with government. Turns out about 40% of the time, the CTO is under CIO. This is the type of business that is like a digital org, like pure play digital org. And then other times, the CTO is even with the CIO or in a different place. In this particular case, we report under the CIO based on that information shaping. And so I would tell you that more of the world is connected to the information superiority, the information dominance, and the information shaping, what we call information warfare, than used to be. For a long time, IW, information warfare, and cyber were thought of as very secondary citizens. Their stake or their place in military affairs below like direct kinetic is very real and very palatable and noticeable. The idea of shaping how the defense region, the defense organization, and the defense ecosystem take and embrace data and information, it's felt real. Like that has been a little bit of a shakeup. And so the shorter answer to the question is my job is to work with the combatant commands, to work with service as a whole, and to listen and help shape what we're doing with industry and our program executive offices, so acquisition, to serve all of our customers in the Department of Navy and at the edge, so at those 11 combatant commands. The actual kind of day-to-day of what that looks like, well, you're nowhere without vision and strategy. So we put out what we call the Information Superiority Vision 2.0 a couple weeks ago now. I think it's 3 weeks fresh. And this is the idea of communicating internally and externally, the importance of information in our decision making and the way that we optimize, secure, and execute as a Department of Navy. The other hat is Tech Director for PEO Digital. That's a mouthful. So Program Executive Office. Who's heard of Program of Record? Okay, so oftentimes if you are a startup and then you want to sell to government, they say the holy grail is selling into a program of record. Turns out there are a lot of programs of record, and all of the programs of record for the most part roll under something like a program management office, which roll up to a PEO. So don't glaze over on me, we're almost done with this part. But acquisition, the idea of spending $250 billion or so per year on acquiring things, all happens for the most part through these PEOs. My PEO digital hat is 8 portfolios of cyber, infrastructure, end user devices, transport, workplace services, all of the things that you think of whenever you think of information technology, and then probably a little bit beyond that, are within this portfolio. And so the kind of advantage of having the CTO hat that does strategy and policy and connecting, and the tech director hat that does forecasting and execution of shaping way forward and execution of piloting way forward for these 8 portfolios. This is one of those cases in the government where I have an amazing team on both sides, and we can shake and bake, and we can go really quickly to learn from each other, to connect dots, and to make things happen. And so to give you a quick example there is, we recently finished a project that was slated for 36 months. It hit the fan, and we finished it in 93 days. We can talk about that one. There was another project where it was on an 18-year trajectory in the past, and we did it in about 17 months. And so point is, when there's a lot of focus and some all-stars around and there's good top cover, your U.S. government and Department of Defense can make big things happen. Now that's on a good day. There are other things and other nuances that we should talk about. But I think Ernestine had a question.
You just put together an awesome PEO directory.
Yes.
More about that.
With your help, right?
It's awesome, right? So one of the things that we all have in common is that we don't understand everything about the DoD, right? Every one of us in this room. It's a big place. Part of what my goals are for the next few minutes are to demystify some of that, make it more approachable. And one of the things that Steve has done recently, and it's on his blog and probably a few other places by now, is he has said, hey, who are your buyers? Here are the 60 buyers within the Department of Defense who are either sustaining or looking for big wins or disruptive capabilities. And so this is just one example of, if you think about the government as a whole, you're missing out. The win-wins, the nuance, the goods, the bads, they're all at the molecular level. And so when we ask ourselves question about, hey, how do I work with the government? How do I connect? How do I even just understand? It's probably 5 or 6 whys to get down there. But there are resources available to really demystify some of that. That type of thing is what made this easier for me to connect dots. And so now on a Saturday, if we say, hey, we're stuck here, who do we need? Someone from the State Department. Who would understand this? Commerce is our buddies. They have a new AISI, the AI Safety Institute, under NIST, under Commerce. We can connect these dots in a more interesting, more meaningful, like more speed of relevance way because of relationships and because of the availability and access of information.
Justin, before I forget, give the class 30 seconds on your background.
Sure.
Is it policy? Is it technology?
Yeah. So I'm going to see if I have access here.
Let me plug this back in. One of these. Here we go.
So when I was younger than you, When I was 17, I signed up for the Air Force. I went through ROTC, so Reserve Officer Training Corps, and my lungs had a better idea, and so I got medically DQ'd and then joined the Navy and as a civilian, and then bounced around. And so I would describe my career as an electrical engineer, as a systems engineer, as a learner. And so I've had the good fortune of working in sector-wise intel, command and control, so decision-making, healthcare, the mobile and kind of emerging tech. I did a tour at DARPA, and then I started to move into the IT space and even some OT space, or operational technology. And so what I've learned across all of those is there are common aspects, specifically within the government, to getting stuff done, to connecting, and then there's almost always something amazing happening outside of the Pentagon that we can learn more from. And so one of my takeaways has been something that I now teach in Hacking for Defense at Georgetown, which is there's often more to learn outside of the building than there is in. And so getting outside of the building is something about me. I make sure to meet with at least 200 companies a year. I make sure to, with my team, connect with a lot of different offices, a lot of different countries, a lot of different just folks who are thinking about problems differently than us, and that intersection learning has meant the world to us. If we find the slide, so from 1986 to 1992, I lived about 15 miles from here, and I used to walk to school when I was like 6, 7 years old. And I would walk by this bar that was like still going from the night before at like 7 a.m. or whenever they let kids walk to school. And it was a Guns N' Roses bar. At least that's what it was in my head. And it was the wildest thing in the world. And so thank you. Find the slides.
I want to hear the bar story.
Bar story is they had this big sign and it said Appetite for Destruction. It was the Guns N' Roses album cover at the time. And so the question that I've been wrestling with and that my team's been wrestling with recently is there's a lot of push right now in the DoD for changing the way that we do things. We recognize that some things that we were doing weren't working anymore. And we've seen almost every sector disrupted, right? Positively disrupted, changed. We've seen the meme. I've seen the meme a lot that said, like, my digital transformation was caused by COVID, right? A lot of sectors have changed the way that they're doing. And the question that I'm wrestling with that I also want you to wrestle with is with and around the U.S. government, DoD, and elsewhere, what is the appetite for disruption? What could we do much, much better? One thing that we've found from piloting for the last 3 years now is as we prototype, as we try not just different technologies, but different ways of operating, it's often not, it doesn't work every time, right? But it's often not 10% better. There are times where it's 100% better or 700% better, right? And so there is a lot of, there's a lot under the curve. There's a lot of opportunity to really change for the better, the opportunities available to us and the opportunities for partnerships. So this is I have a couple favorites in here. This is to say that digital comms transport run the world. And when we think about, hey, what did it used to be like? Maybe a lot of this happened in one service when Steve was in uniform. But post Goldwater Nichols, there's a lot more coordination. And so we all have to be more interoperable, more aware of our partners, and thinking about how to disrupt almost every aspect of that on a regular basis. And so when you graduate, when you are out in particular jobs, if you are looking at, in startup world, what can we do to change the way that we operate? What can we do to help the government help itself? Think about how we're thinking about those problems right now, and then how much help we really need and how much better we can be. So I include this one because it's fun. Has anyone seen this chart before?
No.
This was made famous on Jon Stewart's Daily Show because this was our concept of operations in Afghanistan. Our chief of AI did this chart to illustrate how complex it was. It went viral for the wrong reasons. The idea is some of our problems are really complex. And what I'm here to tell you is with smart people who are dedicated and thinking about problems differently, we can make these simple. We can start to simplify aspects of these problems that scale in a wonderful way. We just walked away from General Mattis, who said allies are the number one focus area, right? Like that's the number one opportunity that we could be taking to surge on, where we can make things simpler for us and our allies. We can change the way that we operate. We can change economics. We can change defense. How many people know how many people can name the sectors of the U.S. economy?
You're allowed to cold call.
All right. So how many sectors are there, roughly? There's different counts, but how many sectors are there in the U.S. economy?
Oh, I don't know.
Wait for it. Anyone to help?
8.
Okay. So it's between 8 and 12, right? There's no sector in the U.S. economy that isn't aided by inventions and innovations within Department of Defense. And so when I was at DARPA, we often talked about, hey, what is the military utility of this? And then what are the other opportunities this creates? Here's the point. The Defense Department and the defense sector, in my mind, is a launch pad for aiding and improving every sector within our economy. So when we can simplify and do things better, it changes the game. I wanted to show you a quick couple org charts before I got into our stuff. So you saw each military department. This shows the CNO and the commandant. Those are the two major military officers. This is one level down for, and I'll let you keep these, but for where we're doing execution. There's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And everyone here has some exposure, some life in the technological aspects of what we're doing. So what are a couple majors out here?
I work for NAVFAC, and I didn't know we're using AI. I mean, is this like future work or? No.
So this is the CIBR topics, but yep, 3.
Civil engineer.
Okay, cool. 3 CIBR topics out of NAVFAC for AI. Win. Other majors?
Policy.
Policy? Very good.
Aeronautics and astronautics.
Awesome. Me too. All right. Cool. So for all of us doing different parts of the overall integrated activities, how we come together in this, I see innovation, technology, and innovation adoption as one of the key drivers for how we can accelerate forward and disrupt ourselves. The reason I pulled the org charts up is both to understand and then also to show you that most organizations don't exist to change the way that they perform, right? What is gravity? What is the bottom line? What is the way that we measure private sector entities, companies? Profit, right? We're clear on that. They have to create value. There are a number of different ways that they might measure themselves, but profit tells us if we're winning or losing. What is the equivalent of profit in government?
budget or on time? Capability?
In wartime or peacetime?
Can I say headcount?
Headcount, I mean, according to yes minister, it's the headcount. The bigger the department, the more powerful you are.
Is anyone satisfied or comfortable? I mean, like almost everyone who answered that question shook their head if you couldn't see them, right? Like side to side. How we show the value within the government is oftentimes less clear. I think we can do that a lot better. I can show you a couple examples where we're disrupting the way that we value activities, specifically in this case through outcome-driven metrics, but moving us forward needs to be about the business case and mission case and showing the difference that we're making. And so I wanted to tell all of you today about an experiment I've been running, my teams have been running within the Department of Navy. And that is to say, what if we are more like a business? What if we are more quantitative? What if we show the value, the outcome for our investments? What if we operate like a value and investor, and in some cases, a growth investor or a facilitator of growth investors to make sure that we have a funnel in from outside organizations and we are an adopter that evaluates ourselves and can show the difference that we're making to all of our customers. So we'll get back on the chairs and I'll answer some questions, but in brief, I mentioned at the beginning we have 8 portfolios. The 8 portfolios within PEO Digital, who has about 700,000 direct supported customers, and then a lot more of that secondarily. We're spending a few billion every year, and then we have contracts for a few billion beyond that. We are trying to, in each case, drastically improve and pull both mission partners and vendor partners or industry partners in to change the way that we do business. And so like a quick story is I have seen at its worst a 6,000 page requirements document, which is a book that no one reads that says how we should do something. And so there are a lot of examples where it takes 2 to 4 years to create a requirements document, and then after that it takes 4 years to start to create a product or to find a product that works there. Are people familiar with this model? And then how quickly, specifically in the IT space, but you can answer for anything, does a generation life last for the types of things that we're acquiring, using, procuring? How long does it take to change over? So not how long do we sustain them, how long until the next version of server, how long until the next, yeah. So like on the personal computing device, probably 18 months. Generationally, we'll say 2 to 5 years max, right? For most computing things, especially commodity. And so what we've done is we've said, hey, even if we run as fast as we can, we're using the wrong method, right? We're using the wrong vehicle. We're operating with the wrong model. And so we've looked to move to a adoption model. And we've said, help us with statement of objectives, help us with top-level requirements, help us with business cases, operate within the Department of Defense so that you, our partners, can show the disruption, the opportunities that we didn't even think of to make us operate better, faster, and more effectively. And I can tell you a number of stories, I don't want to rant, on how that has changed the way that we're moving. Google right now, or after class, the proliferated low Earth orbit activities happening within the Department of Navy. Google Flank Speed Edge and what we're doing between enterprise and ships. These are all things that didn't exist, or at least at scale, 2.5 years ago. And so we have a lot of, because we're enabling partners to come in, help us, catch our blind spots, operate differently. We are now a place where 1 + 1 = 3. And we can do things that at a speed that is relevant.
Justin, sorry, you've used the word partners multiple times.
Yep.
Can you define it for this audience? Are they startups, scale-ups, outside companies, other parts of the DoD? What do you mean by partners?
Good question. I think of partners in general as anyone who is on mission. And so the idea of startups are often in what we call Horizon 3. They're potentially not mature enough for us to field at scale, but we can start piloting. We can indirectly or otherwise help them turn into scale-ups. We have in Horizon 1 a combination of publicly traded companies in the private sector and defense industrial base. But the CNO has said, let's get more players on the field. And she was talking about sailors, but from an ecosystem perspective, we are expanding the pie of who's involved. So what I now mean by players is anyone who can bring gear, tech solutions to the fight. And so we have almost doubled, I believe, the number of small businesses that we're working with, the number of VC-backed companies, this is across DoD, but the number of VC-backed companies has 10x'd in the last few years. Now, are we landing those in the scaled contract activities in Horizon 1? Not as much as we could be at this point. But who I'd call partners, anyone who is either piloting on our radar or that we're putting in those programs of record or PEOs. All right, trying to open the aperture there. So just to summarize a little bit, federal government, a big place, DoD, a big place, Department of Navy, a big place. The most alignment I've seen in 25 years, the most appetite for surging on important things. One of the big challenges in any large organization is, can you do everything well at the same time? Absolutely not. What do startups do about too many priorities? Huh? They fail. What do they do to avoid failing? They cut down the number of priorities, right? They focus. It is incredibly hard to focus within the government, especially if you're not sure what you're measured on, right? So if your goal is, if you're measured in seat count, that was the most unfortunate answer, right? But if you're measured in that, then why would you prioritize, right? What we're trying to do is we're saying now, here, where we can prioritize based on impact, based on effects, based on outcomes, then we have a cut line to decide how far we go. And we do that with our users. We do that with our mission partners, so allies, but we also do that with our vendor partners. Here's an example. If I have $1 for infrastructure, and I want to spend that as gainfully as possible, do I spend that on 5G or P-LEO, so Kuiper or Starlink, or something else? How would you make that decision?
Probably where you want to use it matters. Like if you want something that's applicable to Starlink, it's probably better. But if you want something that's like in a specific area,
Yep. So use case driven. That's the first piece, and then how much difference is it making? What we've traditionally done is we've made decisions based on what have we always done, or where do we need to change a little bit. By looking at this more holistically and saying, hey. We're not the smartest people in the room, we're not the smartest people in the ecosystem, and we're not looking at everything. So why don't you rack and stack yourselves based on impact, and we'll be the detector on, oh, I didn't think about that. By opening the aperture, by interacting with industry differently, it's allowing us to say, that's a better idea than what I had thought of, right? And so in the startups that we're working with, they're very excited about this because right previously, we were capped by, this is the best idea that I have. And now we're capped by, do I understand and believe what they're saying? Which can allow much larger outcomes.
So Justin, give the class 3 categories you're most excited about coming out of startup Stanford, Silicon Valley.
Okay. So one of the areas that's really tricky right now is quantum. The quantum investment in other countries is in some cases larger than the U.S. Are folks familiar with the phrase Q-Day? So public information available saying that investments towards Q-Day or when quantum encryption will be broken, public sources say that that is moving closer. And so the idea of making meaningful investments in quantum to figure out from an encryption perspective or from a capability perspective, think position navigation timing, PNT, like a GPS alternative, or otherwise, where folks can come to us, where at the Quantum World Congress 3 weeks ago, can come to us and say, hey, here are the different use cases that you're not even thinking about. Now we have 10 companies locked and loaded to say, you can catapult us forward in this way.
So that's one.
That's one portfolio. A second portfolio is digital acquisition. And so whenever I talk about requirements, people aren't excited. I actually, for the first time, get excited about acquisition whenever I look at digital acquisition. This is to say that if we have models, maybe digital twin, but if we have models and we have a high-level model and we can hook on top of that, then we can get better insight than a 300-page proposal or an oral discussion. And so most of what I've talked about to this point has been about information technology. But even in cases of hardware or kinetic effects, if we look at a high-level model as here's how I'm thinking about this, here's the art of the possible, then what can you build out from there? Now we can see where competition is. So it's not, I'm going to tell you I'm awesome. Everyone thinks they're awesome. It's we can prove it in a much quicker, narrower gap.
Three.
Please.
You mean like a software-defined vehicle or software-defined something? It's almost like an emulator for something?
It's almost like
an emulator?
Oh, sure. Emulator...
Simulator.
Can be. That is an application. What I'm saying is there is a existing model for, hey, we're going to put a new effect out. Here is a model for that device. So are you emulating it or simulating it? I mean, realistically, we're just saying here is the model-based design, and then different companies can come in and propose against that design. But they have a common foundation.
Okay, number 3.
All right. I'd say transport. I'm really excited about transport right now.
Is that a bus or a car, or what's transport?
Yeah. So comms, formerly known as networks. This is dark fiber. This is undersea cables. This is space communications. This is 5G. These are all ways to make sure that bits turn into effect. When you think about unmanned, everyone thinks about, is it autonomous or is it not? Almost always we're going to want that connected to something that is informing it.
Perfect. Let's take questions from the class. So we got a couple minutes left. Who has the best question? You have a question? Sir.
Yeah, I have a question.
You pick. Go.
So you're talking about all these different ways the Department of Defense is trying to change its model to operate faster, learn from industry faster. With any change in an organizational paradigm, I'm sure there's pushback from some areas of the organization. What have you found is the biggest barrier to implementing this vision of a faster, more, industry focused or to this change, I guess?
Yep. So two things that may be relevant. Number one, I could talk about the division between status quo mindset and the progressive mindset. If you're selling to the government or working with the government, you can find people to work with, and in some cases they'll be twice as good. In some cases they'll be 10 times as effective, right? And so we can dwell on, hey, here are the impediments. I'll answer your question more seriously in a second. But finding those hitters, those people who really, really want to win, identifying those, can be slow at times. And so I think we have a lot of them now, but it took a lot of time to work up to that. And so if I'm ever out here working with the government, I would spend 90% of my energy with people who are transformative. And figuring out who that is, that discovery piece, is very time consuming. A second one that is probably not how you intended the question, but is how I'll answer it, is if we see something that is the best thing ever and it's expensive, we want to scale it, the presidential budget and the what we call the POM, but the 5-year plan means that we can't buy that at scale for at least 3 to 5 years. And so that is, by its very nature, like blocking disruption. And so there's a number of different commissions and studies that have shown us how we can fast track this. And the best way that I've seen that we can do something about this is divestment. And so if we say, hey, here's a new capability, what can we turn off in that place? What can we turn off right now? And so the number one thing I tell vendor partners is they say, I can make you more secure. I don't have any more money to be more secure. But can you turn off 2 or 3 things while you're making me more secure? For transport, if I turn on a PLEO or an external comms path, can I turn off a bunch of routers? Is there a pathway that shows me savings? And so this is Rick over on these are memes that folks created. Point is, we created an initiative called Operation Cattle Drive. Get rid of all of the old stuff that we can. So the biggest impediment to disruption is when we see a gangbusters idea, we have to turn something off. We have an old house in a lot of cases. It's easier for startups in this particular way than established organizations because we have tech debt that has accrued over time. And so everyone who's thinking about how do I support or how do I get into the government should also be thinking about
That's a great insight for startups to actually be thinking about, is not only proposing your new shiny object, but knowing a little deeper about what it could replace so they could actually figure out the budget. Next question.
2 questions. Let's start with Max.
Yeah.
Sure. So, Max, that's the former Navy CTO, so I'm a student here doing a degree and also just startup focused solely on transport. So my question is, where's your front door? Like, how do I navigate that? What do you recommend?
I'll go online right now. So what we actually did here was, and I don't think Steve knows this, but we said, when I took the job, my team is awesome. They were meeting with as many companies as they could, and then I hold long hours and added to them, and so we met with 300 companies. And we're like, how do we do more? And then I think we met with like maybe 400 companies, which is a lot for a year. And we're like, oh, there are more companies than we have time to meet with. And so we created a front door. It's a pilot intake form. We presented that to the other PEOs. Probably 7 of the 18 in Department of Navy were there, and they all said, can we just start using this? And so we have everyone do a 2-page lean business case, including their WAMs, so world-class alignment metrics, so outcome-driven metrics, so that we can rack and stack them, and divestments. So what is your value prop compared to how we're thinking about that? 2 pages instead of, hey, I'd really like to meet with you. If you meet with me, there is 0% chance I can give you a check. But we have RDT&E, we have research and development money that we can cut as those drops come in where we have a budget to say, hey, I want to try this out. From a shots on goal perspective, that completely changes the game for how many pilots we can run and how many people we can meet with. We did 2 pilots 2 years ago. We did 25 last year, and we're going to do a lot more of that than that this year as a community. And so, all right. So shots on goal is one of the keys. And so having people who can come in and make that difference. And our front doors include Naval X, it includes DIU, it includes a lot of organizations that allow us to have something that's ready to transition.
We're going to take one more question, but you're going to stay around a little bit before dinner. One last question. Man.
So you talked about, foreign investment, and I'm curious about the pressures you might be facing either from Congress or from, dual use and other sanctions, since this is a U.S. government in Silicon Valley, of course. So.
Okay, so just in general, the pressure?
In general, and particularly in terms of procurement, right? Because, you're thinking about all of this great innovative stuff, but there's also a lot of unknowns. You don't have the government policymakers who are aware of necessarily what you're talking about, and they're making a policy that could be restricting, what you can do.
Yeah. There are a number of different policies. So, CFIUS has been helpful in terms of doing due diligence and figuring out what's going on and how influences are happening there. But I'd say from tell me if I hit your question, but I'd say from a dual use perspective, where we are able to rack and stack and evaluate and then do due diligence or cyber, we're partnering on that more than we used to. And so if we say, we saw some really hot stuff, they're very early stage, let me send them to InQtel. InQtel can do that due diligence. There are places where there are things below the cut line, and we say, I like this is interesting, this is impactful, but we just don't have enough money. We'll send that to NATO Diana and say, have you checked this out? And then the NATO organization can pilot that, and then they can figure out whether it works or not, and then we can have another chance to adopt it later. And so I'd say the pressure to get better and to work with others is probably greater than some specific pressure to worry too much about some of those other concerns. I could talk about eaches. There are some policies that say, hey, we wouldn't work with a company that's in Iran or something like that. But the eaches of that are, I think, overshadowed by the impact in our partners and using each other's tech.
Justin, this has been amazing. So.